Go. The auto recording. We'll be on our best behavior. Throw up
Are these Zoom meetings mandatory?
for you right now, yes, because I'll be sad if you leave on the very last one. No, I was recording them so that people could watch them at whenever was convenient. So I did not use that word, but it was always nice to see you. Don't leave yet. You only got one more.
Okay.
All righty, here we go. 9/11. 9/11. What's our year?
2001.
2001. Almost to the present day, but you guys keep getting younger, so I got to keep adding events. All righty, so we're going to talk first about jihad, the kind of the roots of the struggle, then the actual attacks on the Twin Towers and other things, and then kind of the aftermath, the reshaping of the larger world as a result of this struggle and this idea of the global South. So let's start with jihad. Do you guys remember when how long does jihad go back?
Goes back a long time. I was looking in the book.
Well, when does Islam start? Remember our Muhammad date?
570 AD.
AD, yeah, it's got to come after Christianity, 570 AD. So that's when it goes back to that time. It goes back to, again, the first, Muhammad, he spread Islam when he invaded Mecca from Medina. Then his successors spread Islam over the next 100 years all over the Mediterranean and into Europe. And they would have likely conquered all of Europe except for what battle? You guys remember that? Or there was a guy named who stopped them in a famous battle in 732. A guy named Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, which was in France. They had conquered Spain and they were pushing up into Europe. And in 732, Charles Martel defeats them at the Battle of Tours or Poitiers. And then they attack Europe from the east centuries later. But at the Siege of Vienna in 1683, they are defeated. Muslim forces are defeated. And so from about 1683, that's kind of an important moment, is that Islamic Jihad kind of dies out because they've been stopped. And so the level of aggression or the threat of Islam dies down. I was just reading the other day a fact that a lot of people don't know. We talked about the transatlantic slave trade with bringing African slaves from Africa, West Africa, over to the North and South America. During that same period of time, more slaves were captured by Muslim forces from Europe and taken to North Africa than Black Africans were taken over to the New World. And so what you want to kind of hit upon in this first point, and a lot of people don't connect with 9/11, is that it's a historical conflict. It goes back all the way to the inception of Islam and the beginning of jihad under Muhammad, and that it has been raging. It raged from 600 to about 1600 for 1,000 years, ongoing. And like I said, there were more Europeans enslaved by militant Muslims during the Atlantic slave trade than even Africans. Not to excuse what the African slave trade at all, but to realize there's always a lot more going on in the background of history than a lot of times we get out of a textbook or that people tell us. And the Battle of Jihad is one of those battles. Does anybody remember what jihad means?
Why not? Wait.
I just highlighted it.
Oh, struggle.
Struggle, yeah. Jihad means struggle. That from its inception, Islam. Good to see you, Micah. From its inception, Islam had this idea. Again, they had the 5 pillars of Islam, and many people argued the 6th pillar was jihad, but that it was that the believer has to struggle against the non-believer, and they have to struggle against the unbelief in their own heart. And so it's an internal character struggle that they have to win, but it's also an external physical conflict against those who don't believe. And various interpreters of Islam have been more aggressive and less aggressive in that. But we see that, but most of them, or a lot of times, they'll reference the life of Muhammad himself and his successors and see that there was a physical jihad, and that, again, the one path that a Muslim had to guaranteed salvation was if they died in the struggle of jihad. And so what we see on September 11th is not just some, outlier of people who got particularly desperate and decided to do something against the United States. It is a continuation of a thousand years or more even of this conflict, or this carrying out of this idea of struggle, of battling against the unbelievers, the pagans, the heathen. And that it was this jihad that really allowed Islam to expand as it did from its very beginning. The more modern form, we a lot of times will call this today militant Islam, where, again, and that's usually meant to reference Muslims who believe in jihad, physical jihad, who say, yeah, I'm going to do it like Muhammad did. He killed Jews, he killed Christians. I'm going to kill the unbelievers too. I'm going to battle against them, or at least I'm going to force them to submit. If they'll submit, then they can spare their lives. But they got to pay taxes. Maybe they'll even let them stay Christians or let them stay Jews, but they have to pay taxation, and they'll live as second-class citizens under them. And so today we call that militant Islam. And it is important to note there are absolutely peaceful Muslims, but the actual core teachings and ideology of Islam is what we're talking about, this jihad. It's kind of a return to, they'll even call it radical Islam, but it really is a return to like fundamental or historical Islam. When you actually look at what happened in the past. The specific school that was in the text is this school called Wahhabism. I'll spell it out. And that's just the word, the kind of the schooling, or the branch of thought that says, we need to wage a physical conflict against unbelievers in the world. And that's where suicide bombers, terrorist cells, things like that. What's the name of the schools where they teach this? I mean, remember that from the slide deck. Starts with an M. Dead silence. Madrasas. So in the madrasas, that's where the militant Islam, or the Wahhabism Islam, is being taught. And of course, that's under that umbrella of teaching, and in that historical context, that's where Osama bin Laden grew up, who go on to then found, what was the organization that he founds? What's the name of Osama bin Laden's organization? You guys just all put on your screens, muted your things, and went and had breakfast. Anybody alive out there?
Can you say the question again?
What's the name of the organization founded by Osama bin Laden? All right, here we go. Al-Qaeda. Good thing you're in school. Al-Qaeda. Whoop, I can't spell that right. There we go. No. Okay, Al-Qaeda, which means the base. And again, it was his vision to use this as a base of carrying out what we call terrorism attacks, but they would call jihadi attacks in the name of Islam against non-believers. And the United States, to move to our second point, the United States becomes a central target of this because how many world powers are there in 2001?
I think it was only the U.S.
Just the U.S. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed. China is still emerging. And so the U.S. really represents the modern world. And so to somebody like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, targeting the United States becomes an obsession because they represent the non-Muslim world that needs to be conquered and brought under the rule of Islam. And so they start looking at what can we, and they attack, first of all, they start by attacking American bases outside of the United States. And they blow up some embassies in like Libya. They attack an American ship in the Persian Gulf, and do some other things like that. I think Kenya has an attack. But then their goal is they really want to take it to the heart of the United States and destroy a symbol of the United States. And that's where they begin to target the Twin Towers, the Capitol building, and the Pentagon. Because the US really is kind of the financial and political center of the world. And then also the Twin Towers are like the financial center of the country, and the Pentagon and the Capitol building are obviously our political centers. So how many planes, what day does the actual attack take place on?
9/11.
Yeah, September 11th, 2001. How many hijackings are there?
4.
Four hijackings. 2 of them hit each of the Twin Towers, 18 minutes apart, which then in about an hour and a half are going to collapse, killing any of the people who were trapped inside, and the heroic firefighters who were climbing up 90 flights of stairs or more with 100 pound of gear trying to reach them. What do the other 2 planes do?
One is the Pentagon.
Okay, one hits the Pentagon, which is like our military, represents the capital of our military. Luckily, that's a very strong concrete structure, so the damage relative to the towers is minimal, though I think something like 189 people are killed. And then the 4th plane.
The 4th one was hijacked by the passengers.
That's right, rehijacked, right? It's retaken. That's United 93, and they take off late, so they actually have information the other passengers didn't have. The other passengers were told, "Hey, we're just hijacking the plane. We were going to take it back to the airport. We're going to make some demands. We have a bomb. We'll blow it up if you fight us, but if you just sit tight, you could have a chance to survive." That's actually how plane hijackings had gone the last couple, 30, 20 years. Plane hijackings happened, but they usually use the people as hostages to negotiate for some kind of demand. So the first couple planes assumed that's what was going on, and it was too late before they realized that was not it. But the guys on the 4th plane, they took off late, and so they began to get phone calls and hear reports of what was happening, and so they knew they were going to die either way. But if they tried to retake the plane, they could potentially save lives. And those heroic people saved our Capitol building, because that 4th plane was probably going to slam into the Congress. Now, well, some people say the White House, but everything I've come across recently, they're pretty sure it was actually the Capitol building, the big domed Congress building. A bigger target, and even a bigger monument than the White House. And so they're pretty sure that's where they were headed. When they captured some guys later and interrogated them, that's what they got out of them. But again, that's an incredible story. And if you get older and you ever get a chance to see the movie United 93, it's incredible what they did. Anybody know the total casualties from the attacks? So just under 3,000 are killed. It's like 2,990 something Americans are killed. And basically we get what's called the war on terror as a result, where now we have to fight not the communists, not the fascists, but we actually have to turn our attention to terrorists. Sorry, just a second, guys. 10 minutes for that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was Mr. Olmsted. So we get this thing called the war on terror. We get this thing called the Bush Doctrine, which says that if you're a country and you harbor groups like Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, you either need to turn them over to us, or we are going to come in and invade your country. And eventually that's what we'll have to do, and we'll talk about that in the 3rd point. Was that a question? So the consequences are, again, the dead, but also the fact that now the U.S. has to completely shift and face a new threat. We're not fighting another country. We're not fighting another government. We're fighting these insurgents, these terrorists who hide out in camps. And some governments tolerate them, but they're not actually the same as those governments. And so it's they don't have uniforms. They don't have really clear leaders. They're kind of spread out. They're decentralized. And so it's a totally new type of war that the U.S. is going to have to try to fight. And that's going to be kind of very, very difficult, and it's going to have some effects on the U.S. involvement in places like the Middle East. So any questions on the first 2 points? We'll go to Global South.
How many people were killed?
Just under 3,000. You can Google the exact amount, but it's just under in the 2,900s. And it's like either 89 or even in the 90s. And that's all three: the passengers on all the planes, the Pentagon, and then most obviously the majority in the Twin Towers, with a huge chunk of them being the firefighters who are actually in there trying to get to the fire. So as a result of the Bush Doctrine and the need to go after terrorism, the U.S., first of all, where do we invade first? Where they're harboring Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda?
Iran or Iraq?
Yeah, neither of those yet. First is Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they were all trained in Afghanistan. There was a government there called the Taliban that was harboring them. And so we said, hey, turn over Al-Qaeda. They refused, and so we invaded. And so we actually still have troops in Afghanistan to this day in an attempt to keep their ability to harbor and protect terrorist organizations from ever attacking again.
Wait, were
2 years
they?
later, go ahead.
Were they the ones who attacked the Twin Towers?
So Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers. Osama bin Laden's group called Al-Qaeda, they were training and being protected in Afghanistan. And so, yes, the point was we got to go out and destroy the camps where these guys are being allowed to practice and prepare, even though they're Afghanistan's a long way from the U.S., but they're allowing them to grow in power and train, and then of course infiltrate American society and pull off these kinds of attacks. They also went into London and blew up some of their double-decker buses. They went to Spain and Madrid and blew up some of their trains. They were carrying out attacks all around the world, and so the idea was we need to go into where these guys are being allowed to grow and train and wipe that out. And the Bush Doctrine was a warning and saying, if you're a country that allows these people safe haven in your country, then you're vulnerable to an attack from us, because we have to do something about this. And so we go into Afghanistan. A couple of years later, we go into Iraq because we fear something similar is going on in Iraq. This leads to kind of just an extended conflict in the Middle East, where the U.S. is fighting various terrorist groups in places like Syria. If you've heard about ISIS, that's a continuation of the struggle, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. In Yemen, fighting in Somalia, any of these countries where they harbor the terrorists, the U.S. has been getting involved. And more recently, that battle has turned more to the use of drones and special forces, not large-scale invasions like Iraq and Afghanistan, because some of the aspects of that didn't go very well, but now more kind of pinpoint targeted attacks on the camps and the terrorist leaders and things like that. The big picture here of what this means is kind of what 9/11 did is 9/11 brought the U.S. into close and a lot of times violent contact with the Middle East. The U.S. was not that involved in the Middle East. Again, a focus was on the Soviet Union, or it was on Europe, or it was on different places. But because of 9/11, all of a sudden now we have troops in the Middle East. And that has some interesting consequences that we're talking about here in this last paragraph. The consequences of that was called the Arab Spring, was that as these Arab and Muslim countries were brought into contact with America and the West and the ideas of Western civilization, they began to rise up and push back against Islamic control, dictatorial control, oppressive governments. And so the Arab Spring was this uprising of Muslims who kind of wanted some of the freedoms that the West and places like Europe and the United States enjoyed. They kind of began to have an influence and an exposure, kind of the same way that like Japan and Korea, where our soldiers fought wars, ended up actually becoming allies or adopting many of the attributes of Western civilization because they were exposed to it. That's what 9/11 starts to kind of do, is it begins to create that interaction in the Middle East, where before the Middle East was a place very closed off to Western civilization, Christianity, and the United States. Do you guys know what the Global South is? The Global South?
The Global South is the where Christianity was also growing, and with large populations too?
Yeah, they're basically countries in the southern hemisphere that tended to have initially smaller Christian populations or completely closed off to Christianity. South America, again, kind of more of a Catholic stronghold, but places like China, India, the Middle East, parts of Africa, Indonesia, these all relied to south of the equator, so they kind of call them the global south, but they represented the segment, basically the segment of world population that had not had a whole lot of contact with Western civilization, our theme through this entire course. And so what the 9/11 attacks and then this US getting involved in the Middle East represents is a chance, not a very nice chance because it's warfare and it's not, wasn't necessarily the intent, but all of a sudden now a greater involvement of America and a greater exposure of Western civilization to the global South. And what has happened in the Middle East is there's kind of been somewhat of an opportunity for evangelism in these Muslim countries due to the destabilizing effects of the war, which again is not good, but one of the side effects or potentially a silver lining is the fact that now the Western civilization and especially Christianity is getting brought into contact with Islam. Did you guys watch the testimony by that Muslim girl who got saved?
Yeah.
That's an example of what's going on, because one way, even with the fact that these wars going on, a lot of times there's refugees leaving these countries, and as those refugees leave, they come to places like Europe or the United States, and all of a sudden they begin to hear the gospel in a way that they've never heard before. And so the amount of Muslim conversion, has greatly increased in the last 20 years than it was prior. And so that's kind of what this third point is, as we look at the big story of world history. What it really did is it took this long-going struggle with jihad, and it caused America to get involved and Europe to get involved in the Middle East. And now all of a sudden, I believe the gospel's being projected forward. And we're, more and more, we have a whole church that we're associated with in Connecticut. And the pastor there, she is an ex-Iraqi who came to the United States, had to flee the war. But now she's formed a church of lots of ex-Iraqis in Connecticut. And these are all ex-Muslims, but she's saved and she's preaching the gospel to them. And none of that happens without these wars in the US, without 9/11 taking place, basically. So that's kind of the perspective on that. That's how this kind of ties together. And then, of course, this is in terms of what's going on in the global South, not only the wars in the Middle East and the greater chance for evangelism, but places where there isn't necessarily war, but places like South America and China are also having huge Christian revivals. And actually India now too, are having huge Christian revivals.
India.
Yeah, that's right. And, there's renewed repression in China. That was the other video I had for you to watch. But the more they seem to clamp down on it, the more they grow. Persecution, you want to grow a church. You want to grow people who actually believe Christianity, aren't just posing, and actually, have a real relationship with God. Persecution a lot of times provides that impetus. And so in India and in China, they're absolutely booming. Again, by 2030, it's projected that China will be the most Christian nation on earth. In Jesus' name, in terms of the government, but probably not by the government, but as far as the pure number of Christians, there will be more Christians in China than there are in the United States. They might have to be hiding, they might be underground, but what was once a region closed off to the gospel is radically being transformed. And a lot of times here in the United States, we don't necessarily see churches growing and people coming to Jesus and great massive revivals and miraculous healings and all this stuff. But in places like Argentina and Brazil and India and China and the Middle East, that stuff's going on. I don't know if it freaked you out watching that girl manifest, that's another discussion during her baptism, but there's amazing religious revival, spiritual warfare going on in the global South. And to a large extent, 9/11 was one of the tipping points in world history that helped push that along. And so in terms of, when we look back in terms of church history, the growth of the church and its spread around the world, the time we're living in right now, we're living that. And God's on the move. The other thing that I'll just mention is, do you remember that the nationality of the pastor who baptized that Muslim girl?
He was Chinese.
Yeah, pretty sure he's Chinese. And the point I want to make on that is because the fact that Christians are growing in China, let's just say, as a reason, Americans are not terribly welcome in Muslim nations right now. If you look like an American, you talk like an American, and you go there and you try to start a church, you're in great danger. And you're not going to have a lot of favor. However, China, good to see you, Justin. However, Chinese, they don't have the same reputation as Americans, and so the Chinese have a great opportunity to go into these nations that have normally been closed off to the gospel and evangelize and start churches and Bible studies and things, because they're usually not open to Europeans and Americans. In fact, China has the Chinese churches are united in this idea of back to Jerusalem, where their whole goal, if you look at a map, they want to evangelize all the Muslim nations from between China and Jerusalem. And they want to basically start a stream of missionaries pushing from China through places like Iran. Iran's having Christian revival, even though they're persecuted, pushing through Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, India, all the way to back till they get back to Jerusalem. And so it's actually if we take time to look at it, this doesn't get in the news, of course, because they're not saved enough, unfortunately. But the church is having a major revival in the global South. And that's a result, or that's part of the story of what we're dealing with when we talk about 9/11. Questions on that? Because I don't know how familiar you guys are with what's going on. And usually that's something we can explain. And there's a few other videos I would show if we had normal class. But any questions, or does that make sense? Again, you have this unreached region by Western civilization and Christianity that now, as a result of, again, the wars in the Middle East, you've got new opportunities of evangelism. In China, God's got his finger on China. There's more and more missionaries in China, and more missionaries now coming from China. Even Tong, you guys know Tong, the senior, he got saved here. And now he's fired up to get China saved. That's an exact example of what this last paragraph is about, how God is reaching these previous regions that were closed off to Christianity. It's an exciting time. Okay, so we'll just go to the so what then. Again, 9/11, one thing you want to take away is, as the first paragraph, is this is just a return to a historical conflict. It's a revival of jihad and militant Islam. It's not a modern thing. It's a very ancient thing that goes all the way back to Muhammad. And it's a long historical struggle of ideas. Islam is a very oppressive teaching. It wants total control of people's lives and their faith through Sharia law. Remember, we talked about Sharia law with Islam, and the ideas of democracy and freedom of religion. They don't get along. And so that's what 9/11 represents, is this clash of ideas, not with fascism and the Nazis, not with communism and the Soviets, but with Islamic fascism, Islamic control. But with that conflict, as I've just finished with, you want to highlight the fact that this is has opened up new opportunities for the gospel to be spread and to be fulfilled. That because of these conflicts and the turmoil, more and more new regions of the world are getting evangelized, and not necessarily by Americans, where they wouldn't normally have a lot of favor or be welcome, but by other nations, by Korean, Chinese, especially, and Indian Muslims. And in South America, because I mentioned they're down there, South America is having a huge Protestant revival. They've always been historically Catholic, but now a lot of the Catholics they're converting to a Bible-based, faith-based Protestantism. And again, whenever we have our conference with our church, we hear the number of churches multiplying in South America is tremendous. So there's new opportunities even in that struggle. Okay, any questions? That's it. That's the last one. I'm gonna not give you any more
Oh,
outlines.
wow.
I'm sorry. No matter how much you beg me or pay me, I won't give you another outline until next year. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So be on the lookout for the practice quiz or the practice test for next week. Make sure you take that next Friday. Make sure you get your website updated by next Friday. Make sure you republish it so that it reflects your changes. For some of you, that's your grade, man. Your grade is hurt because you haven't, and I'm talking even to some of you who watch this video later who aren't here right now. Get your website in order because that will completely shape your grade if you do a good job on it. And let me know if you need help with it because I will help you if you're stuck on something. Okie dokie. Miss you guys. Okay. Well, I'll plan to see you that day in June 3rd. We'll be seeing some of you. So.
Like my soup and up.
All right.
All right, guys. Sam, thanks for letting us see your beautiful face.
Sam,
Watch
can
him
we?
unmute and say thanks, and then go back to me.
All right. Well, I'll see you guys around June 3rd or so. All right.
All right.
Mhm.
You guys have a great day. Happy Friday.